I hope I'm recording. Hi guys. So this past week was about critical thinking. We started out just discussing what is an argument and what's an explanation. How do you tell the two apart? Arguments are claims and premises that lead to a conclusion, a different claim or premise. If you're explaining something, you're just going to have a single claim, or you're going to have claims, and you're never going to come to a conclusion. You're never going to make a case. So an argument has to make a case for something. So as we started defining what an argument looks like, we then moved in to bad arguments. So those are logical fallacies. We talked about fallacies involving emotions. We talked about fallacies involving popularity and traditions, fallacies like a red herring or a smokescreen. We talked about fallacies where you can, try and discount the person. So whether their claim is true or not, discounting the person to discount the claim. We talked about a false dilemma and a slippery slope. And lastly, we talked about the burden of proof and how we beg the question. So I have studied logical fallacies before. I studied them last year in AP Lit, and I think it was super interesting to study them again because I realized how much I didn't actually learn things to apply them in school. I learned them because I knew they were going to be on the test, and I learned them because I knew I needed to know them, but I didn't learn them to understand them, and I didn't learn them to use them in practical life applications. So overall, we talked a lot about structure, like the structure of an argument and how your structure is going to either make or break your argument. You can have a really good argument, but if you give it a bad structure, you're going to have a bad argument. So fallacies are bad arguments of a specific kind. So when we talk about emotions, a fallacy is anything that starts with I feel. So that's not a bad argument, but if it's the way that you feel isn't something that someone else can be sure is true, so your premises aren't true, which makes your conclusion untrue. So then we talked about kind of different emotional fallacies, so a guilt trip, or if you don't believe this, then we're not going to hang out with you, so kind of a peer pressure kind of thing. We talked about how you have to be emotionally intelligent to describe emotions, and because we are emotionally intelligent people, it can be really hard for us to kind of tell the difference between an argument that isn't based on emotion, because we can empathize and sympathize with people because we also feel emotions, and an argument that's based on facts. After that, we talked about popularity fallacies. So, well, Taylor Swift is doing it, so I can do it. Or everybody's saying that this is true doesn't actually make it true. And if what everybody's saying isn't true, it could be true. So there's appeals to popularity, there's appeals to common practice, oh, that's just the culture here that everybody runs 5 minutes late. There can be appeals to traditions, so Thanksgiving, it started as something that they kind of proclaimed that they wanted to do, and then it became a common practice that more and more people were just doing it, and now it's something that if you were to suggest doing something other than watching football or eating turkey on Thanksgiving, everyone looks at you like you're crazy, because it's not something that we do, and that doesn't necessarily ever make something wrong, but it makes it it's a tradition. I mean, there can be good traditions and there can be bad traditions, just like there can be good arguments and bad arguments. So overall, when you look at fallacies, you have to be able to kind of like distinguish where in their argument it breaks down, like where their fallacy is. Because if there's premises are all true and their fallacy lies in the structure of the argument, then picking apart their premises isn't going to do anything. You have to pick apart the structure before you can kind of find the fallacy. So we talked about some other fallacies. We talked about like a red herring. So it's kind of like a distraction. Like this is where the argument's going and someone drops something down here and this kind of like takes you down this other trail to kind of see if they can distract you. Or a smoke screen where someone will just kind of throw a bunch of ideas at you at one time, hoping that you're not going to be able, like you're going to just be overwhelmed. So you'll just kind of concede with whatever they're hoping you would concede with. Then we talked about how to discount a person and like personal attacks on them. So one thing that really stuck out to me that I guess I had never thought of before was that claims, like a bad claim about someone doesn't depend on your character. So I can have good character and make a not true claim, but that isn't a reflection of who I am. Or I can be someone that's not honest and not reliable and can make a true claim because my claims aren't a reflection of my character. So when I think about that, it was really interesting because it's like, yes, there can be some like suspicions when you have someone unreliable making a true claim, but there can also be like that same kind of like, how do we know this is true if you're someone reliable making an untrue claim? So learning how to think in a way that focuses more on the claim and less on the person was a super interesting thought. So there's a couple different ways you can discount a person. You can discount the person themselves. So, is it something that seems ignorant? Is it something that seems stupid? Is it cheap, cruel? Are they uncaring? One of the examples they used was like, could you say that they kick dogs? Like, how can you discount that person? Or you can look at kind of an inconsistency, which could be confused with a fallacy that two wrongs make a right, but inconsistencies focus on the truth of how the truth of your claim isn't related to your personality. So two wrongs make a right focuses on inconsistent like fallacies with actions and proposals. So when you look at an inconsistency, you could say like, oh, this presidential campaign wasn't concerned about global warming then, so how can they be concerned about it now? Like, it's inconsistent with their behavior. People can change their mind, but if it's not as like something that you have steadily seen a change in, it would be an inconsistency, and that could be a fallacy of some sort. Another way that you could find and kind of like destroy someone's claim is the circumstance. So if a professor is saying, I think we should cut the education budget, you're kind of wondering, like, why would a professor want to cut the education budget? What's going on there? Is there something else going on? So when you can pull out something like that and you can really think about what's going on, you can see that it doesn't make sense. It's a bad argument. You can also, what they call, poison the well. So it's destroy things under the surface. And this term came from like an old army term. So when someone was retreating, what they would do is they would poison the wells. So the people that were kind of coming in to overtake the land wouldn't be able to like recover from that. They wouldn't have any of those resources. So when you poison the well, it's finding something, so far deep rooted that if you unsurface, they're not going to be able to recover from that sort of blow. Like their character isn't going to be able to uphold that. So then we talked about like a false dilemma. So like it either has to be A or B. If it's not A, then it has to be B. which is fine. But then you can kind of get into this like perfectionist fallacy where it might not be something, that is the perfect answer, but it can be better than the current reality. And if you're saying, well, it's not perfect, so we're not going to do it, you're never going to make any progress. We talked about slippery slope, which I guess I hadn't ever really thought about before, because to me, this concept was really interesting, how they talk about like, oh, you just have to smoke one cigarette and then you're going to be taking Coke. Like, if A is B, then B is C, and C is D, then A is D. Which was super like, okay, like I see how that plays out, and I see a lot of people how they would like jump to those conclusions. Overall, I think I was acutely aware of a lot of these fallacies. I don't think that there was any that were like entirely new to me because I had studied them last year, so I at least recognized a lot of their names, or if I didn't recognize the name, recognized the style. But it makes me think, like, really conscious about like how I make an argument now. Like, am I using logic fallacies? Am I giving a sound argument? Like, I feel kind of like I'm second guessing some things and like the way that I present information and material because I don't want to have an invalid argument. So it makes me super aware. I think these questions and the content that we covered kind of made me eager to consider a lot more about the world. So when I watch other people argue, I find myself kind of like paying attention to like, oh, I don't think they know that they just gave me a fallacy. Like, that's not a good argument. So I'm kind of like observant in a way that I don't think I was before, just when people present things now, because I want to be able to walk through the structure of the argument and see the premise and see the process and see the conclusion. And when I can do that, you know, if there's nothing wrong with the premise and the process is good and the conclusion is strong and it doesn't rely on the premise and it doesn't, like, the premise doesn't rely on the conclusion, and it's one kind of like flow chart, then it makes, you know, for a strong argument. So I think there were some really good things in here. I don't know that I am a super good arguer. I used to think I was like really good, that like I could win whatever because I could. And now I'm seeing like, oh, maybe I need to stop doing that. So I think there was an idea that they brought up in here from Scotland, and it talks about the way that they do the law. So you can be innocent. In America, you're either innocent or guilty, but in Scotland, you're innocent, not proven guilty, or guilty. So there's this kind of like middle ground where like we might think you're guilty, but you're not guilty. And there's like, it's just this gray area. And it makes me think of like last week when they talked about you have no idea how wrong you are. Like, okay, I'm probably never going to argue perfectly because I'm not going to be perfect. But like, how can I argue less wrong? And this was super good for that. It's really interesting to see how, you know, ideas and concepts from last week are kind of coming into play here. And like, you have no idea how wrong you are, and okay, we need to be critical thinkers, and what does that look like, and how are you, you know, sure that what you're thinking is valid. So overall, it was a really good week. I'm super excited to get into next week. But that's all I got for now. So I will see you soon. Bye.